Book 7. Next, then, I said, make an image of our nature in its education and want of education, likening it to a condition of the following kind. See human beings as though they were in an underground cave-like dwelling with its entrance, a long one, open to the light across the whole width of the cave. They are in it from childhood, with their legs and necks in bonds, so that they are fixed, seeing only in front of them, unable because of the bond to turn their heads all the way around. Their light is from a fire burning far above and behind them. Between the fire and the prisoners, there is a road above, along which see a wall, built like the partitions puppet handlers set in front of the human beings, and over which they show the puppets. I see, he said. Then also see along this wall human beings carrying all sorts of artifacts, which project above the wall, and statues of men and other animals wrought from stone, wood, and every kind of material. As is to be expected, some of the carriers utter sounds, while others are silent. It's a strange image, he said, and strange prisoners you're telling of. They're like us, I said, for in the first place, do you suppose such men would have seen anything of themselves and one another, other than the shadows cast by the fire on the side of the cave facing them? How could they, he said, if they had been compelled to keep their heads motionless throughout life? And what about the things that are carried by? Isn't it the same with them? Of course. If they were able to discuss things with one another, don't you believe they would hold that they are naming these things going by before them that they see? Necessarily. And what if the prison also had an echo from the side facing them? Whenever one of the men passing by happens to utter a sound, do you suppose they would believe that anything other than the passing shadow was uttering the sound? No, by Zeus, he said, I don't. Then most certainly, I said, such men would hold that the truth is nothing other than the shadows of artificial things. Most necessarily, he said. Now consider, I said, what their release and healing from bonds and folly would be like, if something of this sort were by nature to happen to them. Take a man who is released and suddenly compelled to stand up, to turn his neck around, to walk and look up toward the light, and who, moreover, in doing all this is in pain, and because he is dazzled, is unable to make out those things whose shadows he saw before. What do you suppose he'd say if someone were to tell him that before he saw silly nothings, while now, because he is somewhat nearer to what is, and more turned toward beings, he sees more correctly? And in particular, showing him each of the things that pass by, were to compel the man to answer his question about what they are? Don't you suppose he'd be at a loss, and believe that what was seen before is truer than what is now shown? Yes, he said, by far. And if he compelled him to look at the light itself, would his eyes hurt, and would he flee, turning away to those things that he is able to make out and hold them to be really clearer than what is being shown? So he would, he said. And if, I said, someone dragged him away from there by force along the rough, steep, upward way, and didn't let him go before he had dragged him out into the light of the sun, wouldn't he be distressed and annoyed at being so dragged? And when he came to the light, wouldn't he have his eyes full of its beam, and be unable to see even one of the things now said to be true? No, he wouldn't, he said. At least not right away. Then I suppose he'd have to get accustomed, if he were going to see what's up above. At first, he'd most easily make out the shadows, and after that the phantoms of the human beings and the other things in water, and later the things themselves. And from there, he could turn to beholding the things in heaven, and heaven itself, more easily at night, looking at the light of the stars and the moon than by day, looking at the sun and sunlight. Of course. Then, finally, I suppose he would be able to make out the sun, not its appearances in water or some alien place, but the sun itself, by itself in its own region, and see what it's like. Necessarily, he said. And after that, he would already be in a position to conclude about it that this is the source of the seasons and the years. and is the steward of all things in the visible place, and is in a certain way the cause of all those things he and his companions had been seeing. It's plain, he said, that this would be his next step. What then? When he recalled his first home and the wisdom there, and his fellow prisoners in that time, don't you suppose he would consider himself happy for the change, and pity the others? Quite so. And if in that time there were among them any honors, praises, and prizes for the man who is sharpest at making out the things that go by, and most remembers which of them are accustomed to pass before, which after, and which at the same time as others, and who is thereby most able to divine what is going to come, in your opinion, would he be desirous of them, and envy those who are honored and hold power among these men? Or, rather, would he be affected as Homer says, and want very much to be on the soil, a serf to another man, to a portionless man, and to undergo anything whatsoever rather than to opine those things and live that way? Yes, he said. I suppose he would prefer to undergo everything rather than live that way. Now reflect on this too, I said. If such a man were to come down again and sit in the same seat, on coming suddenly from the sun, wouldn't his eyes get infected with darkness? Very much so, he said. And if he once more had to compete with those perpetual prisoners in forming judgments about those shadows, while his vision was still dim, before his eyes had recovered, and if the time needed for getting accustomed were not at all short, wouldn't he be the source of laughter? And wouldn't it be said of him that he went up and came back with his eyes corrupted, and that it's not even worth trying to go up? And if they were somehow able to get their hands on and kill the man who attempts to release and lead up, wouldn't they kill him? No doubt about it, he said. Well then, my dear Glaucon, I said, this image as a whole must be connected with what was said before. Liken the domain revealed through sight to the prison home, and the light of the fire in it to the sun's power, and in applying the going up and the seeing of what's above to the soul's journey up to the intelligible place, you'll not mistake my expectation, since you desire to hear it. A God doubtless knows if it happens to be true. At all events, this is the way the phenomena look to me. In the knowable, the last thing to be seen, and that with considerable effort, is the idea of the good. But once seen, it must be concluded that this is in fact the cause of all that is right and fair in everything. In the visible, it gave birth to light and its sovereign. In the intelligible, itself sovereign, it provided truth and intelligence, and that the man who is going to act prudently in private or in public must see it. I, too, join you in supposing that, he said, at least in the way I can. Come then, I said, and join me in supposing this too, and don't be surprised that the men who get to that point aren't willing to mind the business of human beings, but rather that their souls are always eager to spend their time above. Surely that's likely, if indeed this, too, follows the image of which I told before. Of course it's likely, he said. And what about this? Do you suppose it is anything surprising, I said, if a man come from acts of divine contemplation to the human evils, is graceless, and looks quite ridiculous when, with his sight still dim, and before he has gotten sufficiently accustomed to the surrounding darkness, he is compelled in courts or elsewhere to contest about the shadows of the just, or the representations of which they are the shadows, and to dispute about the way these things are understood by men who have never seen justice itself? It's not at all surprising, he said. But if a man were intelligent, I said, he would remember that there are two kinds of disturbances of the eyes, stemming from two sources, when they have been transferred from light to darkness, and when they have been transferred from darkness to light. And if he held that these same things happen to a soul, too, whenever he saw one that is confused and unable to make anything out, he wouldn't laugh without reasoning, but would go on to consider whether, come from a brighter life, it is in darkness for want of being accustomed, or whether, going from greater lack of learning to greater brightness, it is dazzled by the greater brilliance. and then he would deem the first soul happy for its condition and its life, while he would pity the second. And if he wanted to laugh at the second soul, his laughing in this case would be less a laugh of scorn than would his laughing at the soul which has come from above out of the light. What you say is quite sensible, he said. Then, if this is true, I said, we must hold the following about these things. Education is not what the professions of certain men assert it to be. They presumably assert that they put into the soul knowledge that isn't in it, as though they were putting sight into blind eyes. Yes, he said, they do indeed assert that. But the present argument, on the other hand, I said, indicates that this power is in the soul of each, and that the instrument with which each learns, just as an eye is not able to turn toward the light from the dark without the whole body, must be turned around from that which is coming into being, together with the whole soul, until it is able to endure looking at that which is, and the brightest part of that which is. And we affirm that this is the good, don't we? Yes. There would, therefore, I said, be an art of this turning around, concerned with the way in which this power can most easily and efficiently be turned around, not an art of producing sight in it. Rather, this art takes as given that sight is there, but not rightly turned nor looking at what it ought to look at, and accomplishes this object. So it seems, he said. Therefore, the other virtues of a soul, as they are called, are probably somewhat close to those of the body, for they are really not there beforehand, and are later produced by habits and exercises, while the virtue of exercising prudence is more than anything somehow more divine, it seems. It never loses its power, but according to the way it is turned, it becomes useful and helpful, or, again, useless and harmful. Or haven't you yet reflected about the men who are said to be vicious but wise? How shrewdly their petty soul sees, and how sharply it distinguishes those things toward which it is turned, showing that it doesn't have poor vision, although it is compelled to serve vice, so that the sharper it sees, the more evil it accomplishes. Most certainly, he said. However, I said, if this part of such a nature were trimmed in earliest childhood, and its ties of kinship with becoming were cut off, like leaden weights, which eating and such pleasures, as well as their refinements, naturally attach to the soul and turn its vision downward. If, I say, it were rid of them and turned around toward the true things, this same part of the same human beings would also see them most sharply, just as it does those things toward which it now is turned. It's likely, he said. And what about this? Isn't it likely, I said, and necessary, as a consequence of what was said before, that those who are without education and experience of truth would never be adequate stewards of a city, nor would those who have been allowed to spend their time in education continuously to the end, the former because they don't have any single goal in life at which they must aim in doing everything they do in private or in public, the latter because they won't be willing to act, believing they have emigrated to a colony in the Isles of the Blessed, while they are still alive. True, he said. Then our job as founders, I said, is to compel the best natures to go to the study which we were saying before is the greatest, to see the good, and to go up that ascent. And when they have gone up and seen sufficiently, not to permit them what is now permitted. What's that? To remain there, I said, and not be willing to go down again among those prisoners, or share their labors and honors, whether they be slighter or more serious. What, he said, are we to do them an injustice, and make them live a worse life, when a better is possible for them? My friend, you have again forgotten, I said, that it's not the concern of law that any one class in the city fare exceptionally well, but it contrives to bring this about in the city as a whole, harmonizing the citizens by persuasion and compulsion, making them share with one another the benefit that each is able to bring to the commonwealth. And it produces such men in the city, not in order to let them turn whichever way each wants, but in order that it may use them in binding the city together. That's true, he said. I did forget. Well then, Glaucon, I said, consider that we won't be doing injustice to the philosophers who come to be among us, but rather that we will say just things to them, while compelling them besides to care for and guard the others. We'll say that when such men come to be in the other cities, it is fitting for them not to participate in the labors of those cities, for they grow up spontaneously against the will of the regime in each, and a nature that grows by itself and doesn't owe its rearing to anyone has justice on its side, when it is not eager to pay off the price of rearing to anyone. But you we have begotten for yourselves and for the rest of the city, like leaders and kings in hives. You have been better and more perfectly educated, and are more able to participate in both lives. So you must go down, each in his turn, into the common dwelling of the others, and get habituated along with them to seeing the dark things. And in getting habituated to it, you will see 10,000 times better than the men there, and you'll know what each of the phantoms is, and of what it is a phantom, because you have seen the truth about fair, just, and good things. And thus the city will be governed by us and by you in a state of waking, not in a dream, as the many cities nowadays are governed by men who fight over shadows with one another and form factions for the sake of ruling, as though it were some great good. But the truth is surely this: that city in which those who are going to rule, or at least eager to rule, is necessarily governed in the way that is best and freest from faction, while the one that gets the opposite kind of rulers is governed in the opposite way. Most certainly, he said. Do you suppose our pupils will disobey us when they hear this, and be unwilling to join in the labors of the city, each in his turn, while living the greater part of the time with one another in the pure region? Impossible, he said, for surely we shall be laying just injunctions on just men. However, each of them will certainly approach ruling as a necessary thing, which is the opposite of what is done by those who now rule in every city. That's the way it is, my comrade, I said. If you discover a life better than ruling for those who are going to rule, it is possible that your well-governed city will come into being. For here alone will the really rich rule, rich not in gold, but in those riches required by the happy man, rich in a good and prudent life. But if beggars, men hungering for want of private goods, go to public affairs, supposing that in them they must seize the good, it isn't possible. When ruling becomes a thing fought over, such a war, a domestic war, one within the family, destroys these men themselves, and the rest of the city as well. That's very true, he said. Have you, I said, any other life that despises political offices, other than that of true philosophy? No, by Zeus, he said, I don't. But men who aren't lovers of ruling must go to it. Otherwise, rival lovers will fight. Of course. Who else will you compel to go to the guarding of the city than the men who are most prudent in those things through which a city is best governed, and who have other honors and a better life than the political life? No one else, he said. Do you want us now to consider in what way such men will come into being, and how one will lead them up to the light, just as some men are said to have gone from Hades up to the gods? How could I not want to, he said. Then, as it seems, this wouldn't be the twirling of a shell, but the turning of a soul around from a day that is like night to the true day. It is that ascent to what is, which we shall truly affirm to be philosophy. Most certainly. Then mustn't we consider what studies have such a power? Of course. What then, Glaucon, would be a study to draw the soul from becoming to being? And as I speak, I think of this. Weren't we saying that it's necessary for these men to be champions in war when they are young? Yes, we were saying that. Then the study we are seeking must have this further characteristic in addition to the former one. What? It mustn't be useless to warlike men. Of course it mustn't, he said, if that can be. Now previously they were educated by us in gymnastic and music. That was so, he said. And gymnastic, of course, is wholly engaged with coming into being and passing away, for it oversees growth and decay in the body. It looked that way. So it wouldn't be the study we are seeking. No, it wouldn't. And is music, so far as we described it before. But it, he said, was the antistrophe to gymnastic. If you remember, it educated the guardians through habits, transmitting by harmony a certain harmoniousness, not knowledge, and by rhythm, a certain rhythmicalness. And connected with it were certain other habits, akin to these, conveyed by speeches, whether they were tales or speeches of a truer sort. But as for a study directed toward something of the sort you are now seeking, there was nothing of the kind in it. Your reminder to me is quite precise, I said, for really it had nothing of the sort. But, Glaucon, you demonic man, what could there be that is like this? For all the arts surely seemed to be mechanical. Certainly they were. And yet, what other study is left now separate from music, gymnastic, and the arts? Come then, I said, if we have nothing left to take besides these, let's take something that applies to them all. What kind of thing? For example, this common thing that all kinds of art, thought, and knowledge use as a supplement to themselves, a thing that it is necessary for everyone to learn among his first studies. What's that? He said. The lowly business, I said, of distinguishing the one, the two, and the three. I mean by this, succinctly, number and calculation. Or isn't it the case with them that every kind of art and knowledge is compelled to participate in them? Very much so, he said. The art of war, too, I said. Most necessarily, he said. At all events, I said, in the tragedies, Palamedes is constantly showing up Agamemnon as a most ridiculous general. Or haven't you noticed that he says that by discovering number, he established the dispositions for the army at Ilium, and counted the ships and everything else? As though before that they were uncounted, and Agamemnon didn't know how many feet he had, if he really didn't know how to count. And if this is the case, what kind of general do you suppose he was? A strange one, he said, if this was true. Shall we not then, I said, set down as a study necessary for a warrior the ability to calculate and to number? Most of all, he said, if he's going to have any professional knowledge of the order of the army, but I should say rather, if he's going to be a human being. Do you, I said, notice the same thing I do in this study? What? It probably is one of those things we are seeking that by nature lead to intellection. But no one uses it rightly, as a thing that in every way is apt to draw men toward being. How do you mean, he said. I shall attempt to make at least my opinion plain. Join me in looking at the things I distinguish for myself as leading or not leading to what we are speaking of, and agree or disagree so that we may see more clearly whether this is as I divine it to be. Show, he said. Here, I show, I said, if you can make it out, that some objects of sensation do not summon the intellect to the activity of investigation, because they seem to be adequately judged by sense, while others bid it in every way to undertake a consideration, because sense seems to produce nothing healthy. Plainly, you mean things that appear from far off, he said, and shadow paintings. You have hardly got my meaning, I said. Then what do you mean, he said. The ones that don't summon the intellect, I said, or all those that don't at the same time go over to the opposite sensation. But the ones that do go over, I class among those that summon the intellect. When the sensation doesn't reveal one thing any more than its opposite, regardless of whether the object strikes the senses from near or far off. But you will see my meaning more clearly this way. These, we say, would be 3 fingers, the smallest, the second, and the middle. Certainly, he said. Think of them while I'm speaking as if they were being seen up close. Now consider this about them for me. What? Surely each of them looks equally like a finger. And in this respect, it makes no difference whether it's seen in the middle or on the extremes, whether it's white or black or whether it's thick or thin, or anything else of the sort. In all these things, the soul of the many is not compelled to ask the intellect what a finger is. For the sight at no point indicates to the soul that the finger is at the same time the opposite of a finger. No, he said, it doesn't. Then, I said, it isn't likely that anything of the sort would be apt to summon or awaken the activity of intellect. No, it's not likely. Now what about this? Does the sight see their bigness and littleness adequately? And does it make no difference to it whether a finger lies in the middle or on the extremes? And similarly with the touch, for thickness and thinness, or softness and hardness? And do the other senses reveal such things without insufficiency? Or doesn't each of them do the following? First, the sense set over the hard is also compelled to be set over the soft, and it reports to the soul that the same thing is sensed by it, as both hard and soft? So it does, he said. Isn't it necessary, I said, that in such cases the soul be at a loss as to what the sensation indicates by the hard, if it says that the same thing is also soft, and what the sensation of the light and of the heavy indicates by the light and heavy, if it indicates that the heavy is light and the light heavy? Yes, indeed, he said. These are strange interpretations received by the soul, and require further consideration. Therefore, I said, it's likely that in such cases a soul, summoning calculation and intellect, first tries to determine whether each of the things reported to it is one or two. Of course. If it appears to be two, won't each of the two appear to be different and to be one? Yes. Then, if each is one, and both two, the soul will think the two as separate. For it would not think the inseparable as two, but as one. Right. But sight, too, saw big and little, we say not separated, however, but mixed up together. Isn't that so? Yes. In order to clear this up, the intellect was compelled to see big and little, too. Not mixed up together, but distinguished, doing the opposite of what the sight did. True. Isn't it from here that it first occurs to us to ask what the big and the little are? That's entirely certain. And so, it was on this ground that we called the one intelligible and the other visible. Quite right, he said. Well then, this was what I was just trying to convey in saying that some things are apt to summon thought, while others are not, defining as apt to summon it those that strike the sense at the same time as their opposites, while all those that do not are not apt to arouse intellection. Well, now I understand, he said, and in my opinion it is so. What then? To which of the two do number and the one seem to belong? I can't conceive, he said. Figure it out on the basis of what was said before, I said. For if the one is adequately seen, itself by itself, or is grasped by some other sense, it would not draw men toward being, as we were saying about the finger. But if some opposition to it is always seen at the same time, so that nothing looks as though it were one more than the opposite of one, then there would now be need of something to judge. And in this case, a soul would be compelled to be at a loss and to make an investigation, setting in motion the intelligence within it, and to ask what the one itself is. And thus, the study of the one would be among those apt to lead and turn around toward the contemplation of what is. Surely, he said, the sight, with respect to the one, possesses this characteristic to a very high degree. For we see the same thing at the same time, as both one and as an unlimited multitude. If this is the case with the one, I said, won't it be the same for all number? Of course. And further, the arts of calculation and number are both wholly concerned with number. Quite so. Then it looks as if they lead toward truth. Preternaturally so. Therefore, as it seems, they would be among the studies we are seeking. It's necessary for a warrior to learn them for the sake of his dispositions for the army, and for a philosopher because he must rise up out of becoming and take hold of being, or else never become skilled at calculating. That's so, he said. And our guardian is both warrior and philosopher. Certainly. Then it would be fitting, Glaucon, to set this study down in law and to persuade those who are going to participate in the greatest things in the city to go to calculation and to take it up, not after the fashion of private men, but to stay with it until they come to the contemplation of the nature of numbers with intellection itself, not practicing it for the sake of buying and selling, like merchants or tradesmen, but for war and for ease of turning the soul itself around from becoming to truth and being. What you say is very fine, he said. And further, I said, now that the study of calculation has been mentioned, I recognize how subtle it is and how in many ways it is useful to us for what we want, if a man practices it for the sake of coming to know and not for trade. In what way, he said. In the very way we were just now saying. It leads the soul powerfully upward and compels it to discuss numbers themselves. It won't at all permit anyone to propose for discussion numbers that are attached to visible or tangible bodies. For surely you know the way of men who are clever in these things. If in the argument someone attempts to cut the one itself, they laugh and won't permit it. If you try to break it up into small coin, they multiply, taking good care against the ones ever looking like it were not one, but many pieces. What you say is very true, he said. What, Glaucon, do you suppose, would happen if someone were to ask them, you surprising men, what sort of numbers are you discussing, in which the one is as your axiom claims it to be, each one equal to every other one, without the slightest difference between them, and containing no parts within itself? What do you suppose they would answer? I suppose they would answer that they are talking about those numbers that admit only of being thought and can be grasped in no other way. Do you see then, my friend, I said, that it's likely that this study is really compulsory for us, since it evidently compels the soul to use the intellect itself on the truth itself? It most certainly does do that, he said. What about this? Have you already observed that men who are by nature apt at calculation are naturally quick in virtually all studies, while those who are slow, if they are educated and given gymnastic in it, all make progress by becoming quicker than they were, even if they are benefited in no other way? That's so, he said. And further, I don't suppose you would easily find many studies that take greater effort in the learning and in the practice than this. Certainly not. Then, for all these reasons, this study shouldn't be neglected, and the best natures must be educated in it. I join my voice to yours, he said. Therefore, we have settled on this one, I said, and let's consider whether the study adjoining this one is in any way suitable. What is it, he said, or do you mean geometry? That's exactly it, I said. As much of it as applies to the business of war is plainly suitable, he said. In pitching camp, assaulting places, gathering the army together and drawing it up in line, and in all other maneuvers armies make in the battle itself and on marches, it would make quite a difference to a man whether he were skilled in geometry or not. However, I said, for such things only a small portion of geometry, as of calculation, would suffice. It must be considered whether its greater and more advanced part tends to make it easier to make out the idea of the good. And we say that this tendency is possessed by everything that compels the soul to turn around to the region inhabited by the happiest part of what is, which is what the soul must, by all means, see. What you say is right, he said. Then if geometry compels one to look at being, it is suitable. If at becoming, it is not suitable. That is what we affirm. Well then, I said, none of those who have even a little experience with geometry will dispute it with us. This kind of knowledge is exactly the opposite of what is said about it in the arguments of those who take it up. How, he said. In that they surely speak in a way that is as ridiculous as it is necessary. They speak as though they were men of action, and were making all the arguments for the sake of action, uttering sounds like squaring, applying, adding, and everything of the sort, whereas the whole study is surely pursued for the sake of knowing. That's entirely certain, he said. Mustn't we also come to an agreement about the following point? What? That it is for the sake of knowing what is always, and not at all for what is at any time coming into being and passing away. That may well be agreed, he said. For geometrical knowing is of what is always. Then, you noble man, it would draw the soul toward truth and be productive of philosophic understanding in directing upward what we now improperly direct downward. It does so, he said, to the greatest extent possible. Then to the greatest extent possible, I said, the men in your beautiful city must be enjoined in no way to abstain from geometry, for even its byproducts aren't slight. What are they? He said. What you said about war, of course, I said, and in addition, with respect to finer reception of all studies, we surely know there is a general and complete difference between the man who has been devoted to geometry and the one who has not. Yes, by Zeus, he said, the difference is complete. Then shall we set this down as the second study for the young? Yes, he said, we shall set it down. And what about this? Shall we set astronomy down as the third? Or doesn't it seem to be the thing? It does, at least to me, he said. A better awareness of seasons, months, and years is suitable not only for farming and navigation, but no less so for generalship. You are amusing, I said. You are like a man who is afraid of the many in your not wanting to seem to command useless studies. It's scarcely an ordinary thing. Rather, it's hard to trust that in these studies, a certain instrument of everyone's soul, one that is destroyed and blinded by other practices, is purified and rekindled, an instrument more important to save than 10,000 eyes. For with it alone is truth seen. To those who share your opinion about this, what you say will seem indescribably good, while all those who have had no awareness at all of it can be expected to believe you are talking nonsense. They see no other benefit from these studies worth mentioning. Consider right here with which of these two kinds of men you are discussing. Or are you making the arguments for neither, but chiefly for your own sake, without, however, grudging anyone else who might be able to get some profit from them? I choose the latter, he said, to speak and ask and answer mostly for my own sake. Well then, I said, retreat away. What we took up as following geometry just now wasn't right. Where was the mistake, he said. After a plane surface, I said, we went ahead and took a solid in motion before taking it up by itself. But the right way is to take up the third dimension next, in order after the second, and this is surely the dimension of cubes and what participates in depth. Yes, it is, he said. But, Socrates, it doesn't seem to have been discovered yet. Of that, I said, there are two causes. Because no city holds it in honor, it is feebly sought due to its difficulty. And those who seek for it need a supervisor, without whom they would not find it. And in the first place, he's hard to come by, and then even when he's there, as things stand, he wouldn't be obeyed by those given to seeking it because of their high opinion of themselves. But if a whole city should join in supervising it and take the lead in honoring it, these men would obey. And with it being continuously and eagerly sought for, its character would come to light. For even now, although it is despised and cut short by the many, and by those who seek it, since they have no account to give of the way it is useful, nevertheless in the face of all this it grows per force, due to its charm. So it wouldn't be at all surprising if it came to light. Yes, indeed, he said, it is exceptionally charming. But tell me more clearly what you meant just now. You presumably set geometry down as that which treats of the plane. Yes, I said. Then, he said, at first you set down astronomy after geometry, but later you withdrew. My haste to go through everything quickly is the cause of my being slowed down, I said. The investigation of the dimension with depth was next in order, but due to the ridiculous state of the search for it, I skipped over it after geometry and said astronomy, which treats the motion of what has depth. What you say is right, he said. Well then, I said, as the fourth study, let's set down astronomy, assuming that the study that is now being left aside will be present if a city pursues it. That's likely, he said, and on the basis of the reproach you just made me for my vulgar praise of astronomy, Socrates. Now I shall praise it in the way that you approach it. In my opinion, it's plain to everyone that astronomy compels the soul to see what's above and leads it there away from the things here. Perhaps it's plain to everyone except me, I said. In my opinion, that's not the way it is. Then how is it? He said. As it is taken up now by those who lead men up to philosophy, it has quite an effect in causing the soul to look downward. How do you mean? He said. In my opinion, I said, it's no ignoble conception you have for yourself of what the study of the things above is. Even if a man were to learn something by tilting his head back and looking at decorations on a ceiling, you would probably believe he contemplates with his intellect and not his eyes. Perhaps your belief is a fine one, and mine innocent. I, for my part, am unable to hold that any study makes a soul look upward, other than the one that concerns what is, and is invisible. And if a man gaping up or squinting down attempts to learn something of sensible things, I would deny that he ever learns, for there is no knowledge of such things, or that his soul looks up rather than down, even if he learns while floating on his back on land or sea. I am paying the just penalty, he said. You are right in reproaching me. But just what did you mean when you said that astronomy must be studied in a way contrary to the one in which they now study it, if it's going to be studied in a way that's helpful for what we are talking about? As follows, I said. These decorations in the heaven, since they are embroidered on a visible ceiling, may be believed to be the fairest and most precise of such things. But they fall far short of the true ones, those movements in which the really fast and the really slow, in true number and in all the true figures, are moved with respect to one another, and in their turn move what is contained in them. They, of course, must be grasped by argument and thought, not sight. Or do you suppose otherwise? Not at all, he said. Therefore, I said, the decoration in the heaven must be used as patterns for the sake of learning these other things, just as if one were to come upon diagrams exceptionally carefully drawn and worked out by Daedalus or some other craftsman or painter. A man experienced in geometry would, on seeing such things, presumably believe that they are fairest in their execution, but that it is ridiculous to consider them seriously, as though one were to grasp the truth about equals, doubles, or any other proportion in them. How could it be anything but ridiculous? He said. Then, I said, don't you suppose that a man who is really an astronomer will have the same persuasion in looking at the movements of the stars? He will hold that the craftsmen of heaven composed it, and what's in it is beautifully, as such works can be composed. But as for the proportion of night to day, of these to a month, of a month to a year, and of the rest of the stars to these and to one another, don't you think you will consider strange the man who holds that these are always the same and deviate in no way at all? For these things are connected with body and are visible. Hence won't he consider it strange to seek in every way to grasp their truth? That is my opinion, he said, at least now that I am listening to you. Therefore, I said, by the use of problems as in geometry, we shall also pursue astronomy, and we shall let the things in the heaven go, if by really taking part in astronomy, we are going to convert the prudence by nature and the soul from uselessness to usefulness. The task you prescribe, he said, is many times greater than what is now done in astronomy. And, I said, I suppose our prescriptions in the rest will also be of the same kind, if we are to be of any help as lawgivers. But have you any suitable study to suggest? No, I haven't, he said, at least not right now. However, I said, motion presents itself not in one form, but several, as I suppose. Perhaps whoever is wise will be able to tell them all, but those that are evident even to us are two. What are they? In addition to astronomy, I said, there is its antistrophe. What's that? It is probable, I said, that as the eyes are fixed on astronomy, So the ears are fixed on harmonic movement, and these two kinds of knowledge are in a way akin. As the Pythagoreans say, and we, Glaucon, agree. Or what shall we do? That, he said. Then, I said, since it's a big job, we'll inquire of the Pythagoreans what they mean about them, and if there is anything else besides them. But throughout all of this, we shall keep a guard over our interest. What's that? That those whom we shall be rearing should never attempt to learn anything imperfect, anything that doesn't always come out at the point where everything ought to arrive, as we were just saying about astronomy. Or don't you know that they do something similar with harmony too? For measuring the heard accords and sounds against one another, they labor without profit, like the astronomers. Yes, by the gods, he said, and how ridiculous they are. They name certain notes dense and set their ears alongside, as though they were hunting a voice from the neighbor's house. Some say they distinctly hear still another note in between, and that this is the smallest interval by which the rest must be measured, while others insist that it is like those already sounded. Both put ears before the intelligence. You mean, I said, those good men who harass the strings and put them to the torture, racking them on the pegs. I won't prolong the image with the blow struck by the plectrum, and the accusation against the strings, and their denial and imposture. I will put an end to the image by saying that it isn't these men I mean, but those whom we just now said we are going to question about harmony. They do the same thing the astronomers do. They seek the numbers in these heard accords, and don't rise to problems, to the consideration of which numbers are concordant, and which not, and why in each case. The thing you are speaking of, he said, is demonic. Useful, rather, for the quest after the fair and the good, I said. But pursued in any other way, it is useless. That's likely, he said. And I suppose, I said, that if the inquiry into all the things we have gone through arrives at their community and relationship with one another, and draws conclusions as to how they are akin to one another, then the concern with them contributes something to what we want, and is not a labor without profit, but otherwise it is. I too divine that this is the case, he said. But it's a very big job you speak of, Socrates. Do you mean the prelude, or what? I said. Or don't we know that all of this is a prelude to the song itself, which must be learned? For surely it's not your opinion that the men who are clever at these things are dialecticians. No, by Zeus, he said, with the exception of a very few whom I have encountered. But, I said, was it ever your opinion that men who are unable to give an account, and receive one, will ever know anything of what we say they must know? To this question, too, he said, the answer is no. Glaucon, I said, isn't this at last the song itself that dialectic performs? It is in the realm of the intelligible, but it is imitated by the power of sight. We said that sight at last tries to look at the animals themselves, and at stars themselves, and then finally at the sun itself. So, also, when a man tries by discussion, by means of argument without the use of any of the senses, to attain to each thing itself that is, and doesn't give up before he grasps by intellection itself that which is good itself, he comes to the very end of the intelligible realm, just as that other man was then at the end of the visible. That's entirely certain, he said. What then? Don't you call this journey dialectic? Of course. Then, I said, the release from the bonds and the turning around from the shadows to the phantoms and the light, the way up from the cave to the sun, and once there, the persisting inability to look at the animals and the plants and the sun's light, and looking instead at the divine appearances in water and at shadows of the things that are, rather than as before at shadows of phantoms cast by a light that, when judged in comparison with the sun, also has the quality of a shadow of a phantom. All this activity of the arts, which we went through, has the power to release and leads what is best in the soul up to the contemplation of what is best in the things that are, just as previously what is clearest in the body was led to the contemplation of what is brightest in the region of the bodily and the visible. I accept this as so, he said. It seems to me extremely hard to accept, however, but in another way hard not to accept. All the same, since it's not only now that these things must be heard, but they must all be returned to many times in the future, taking for granted that this is as has now been said. Let's proceed to the song itself, and go through it just as we went through the prelude. So tell what the character of the power of dialectic is, and then into exactly what forms it is divided, and finally what are its ways. For these, as it seems, would lead at last toward that place which is for the one who reaches it a haven from the road, as it were, and an end of his journey. You will no longer be able to follow me, my dear Glaucon, I said, although there wouldn't be any lack of eagerness on my part. But you would no longer be seeing an image of what we are saying, but rather the truth itself, at least as it looks to me. Whether it is really so, or not, can no longer be properly insisted on. But that there is some such thing to see must be insisted on. Isn't it so? Of course. And also that the power of dialectic alone could reveal it to a man experienced in the things we just went through, while it is in no other way possible. Yes, he said, it's proper to insist on that too. At least, I said, no one will dispute us when we say that some other inquiry methodically attempts with respect to everything to grasp, about each several thing itself, what each is. For all the other arts are directed to human opinions and desires, or to generation and composition, or to the care of what is grown or put together. And as for the rest, those that we said do lay hold of something of what is, geometry and the arts following on it. We observe that they do dream about what is, but they haven't the capacity to see it in full awakeness so long as they use hypotheses, and leaving them untouched, are unable to give an account of them. When the beginning is what one doesn't know, and the end and what comes in between are woven out of what isn't known, what contrivance is there for ever turning such an agreement into knowledge? None, he said. Then, I said, only the dialectical way of inquiry proceeds in this direction, destroying the hypotheses, to the beginning itself in order to make it secure, and when the eye of the soul is really buried in a barbaric bog, dialectic gently draws it forth and leads it up above, using the arts we described as assistants and helpers in the turning around. Out of habit we called them kinds of knowledge several times, but they require another name, one that is brighter than opinion, but dimmer than knowledge. Thought was, I believe, the word by which we previously distinguished it. But in my opinion, there is no place for dispute about a name when a consideration is about things so great as those lying before us. No, there isn't, he said. Then it will be acceptable, I said, just as before, to call the first part knowledge, the second thought, the third trust, and the fourth imagination, and the latter two taken together opinion, and the former two intellection. And opinion has to do with coming into being, and intellection with being, and as being is to coming into being, so is intellection to opinion, and as intellection is to opinion, so is knowledge to trust, and thought to imagination. But as for the proportion between the things over which these are set, and the division into two parts of each, the opinable and the intelligible, let's let that go, Glaucon, so as not to run afoul of arguments many times longer than those that have been gone through. Well, he said, about the rest, insofar as I am able to follow, I share your opinion. And do you also call that man dialectical, who grasps the reason for the being of each thing? And as for the man who isn't able to do so, to the extent he's not able to give an account of a thing to himself and another, won't you deny that he has intelligence with respect to it? How could I affirm that he does, he said. Isn't it also the same with the good? Unless a man is able to separate out the idea of the good from all other things and distinguish it in the argument, and going through every test, as it were in battle, eager to meet the test of being rather than that of opinion, he comes through all this with the argument still on its feet. You will deny that such a man knows the good itself, or any other good, and if he somehow lays hold of some phantom of it, you will say that he does so by opinion and not knowledge, and that taken in by dreams and slumbering out his present life, before waking up, here he goes to Hades and falls finally asleep there? Yes, by Zeus, he said, I shall certainly say all that. Then, as for those children of yours whom you are rearing and educating in speech, if you should ever rear them indeed, I don't suppose that while they are as irrational as lines, you would let them rule in the city and be the sovereigns of the greatest things. No, I wouldn't, he said. Then will you set it down as a law to them that they pay special attention to the education on the basis of which they will be able to question and answer most knowledgeably? I shall join with you, he said, in setting down this law. Is it your opinion, I said, that we have placed dialectic at the top of the studies like a coping stone, and that no other study could rightly be set higher than this one, but that the treatment of the studies has already reached its end? Yes, it is my opinion, he said. Well then, I said, the distribution is still ahead of you. To whom shall we give these studies, and how shall we do it? That's plainly the next question, he said. Do you remember, in the former selection of the rulers, what sort of men we selected? How could I not remember, he said. Well then, so far as most of the requirements go, suppose that those are the natures that must be chosen, I said. The steadiest and most courageous must be preferred, and insofar as possible, the best looking. But besides this, one must seek for men who are not only by disposition noble and tough, but who also possess those qualities in their nature that are conducive to this education. What do you determine them to be? Keenness at studies, you blessed man, I said, is a prerequisite for them, and learning without difficulty. For souls, you know, are far more likely to be cowardly in severe studies than in gymnastic. The labor is closer to home in that it is the soul's privately, and not shared in common with the body. True, he said. And, of course, a man with a memory and who is firm and wholly a lover of labor must be sought. Or in what way do you suppose anyone will be willing both to perform the labors of the body and to complete so much study and practice? No one would, he said, unless he has an entirely good nature. At any rate, I said, the current mistake in philosophy, as a result of which, as we also said before, dishonor has befallen philosophy, is that men who aren't worthy take it up. Not bastards, but the genuine should have taken it up. What do you mean, he said. In the first place, I said, the man who is to take it up must not be lame in his love of labor, loving half the labor while having no taste for the other half. This is the case when a man is a lover of gymnastic and the hunt, and loves all the labor done by the body, while he isn't a lover of learning or of listening, and isn't an inquirer, but hates the labor involved in all that. Lame as well is the man whose love of labor is directed exclusively to the other extreme. What you say is very true, he said. And likewise with respect to truth, I said. Won't we class as maimed a soul that hates the willing lie, both finding it hard to endure in itself and becoming incensed when others lie, but it is content to receive the unwilling lie, and when it is caught somewhere being ignorant, isn't vexed but easily accommodates itself, like a swinish beast, to wallowing in lack of learning? That's entirely certain, he said. And with respect to moderation, I said, and courage and magnificence and all the parts of virtue, a special guard must be kept for the man who is bastard, and the one who is genuine. When a private man and a city don't know how to make a complete consideration of such things, for whatever services they happen to need, they unawares employ lame men and bastards as friends or rulers. That's just the way it is, he said. So, I said, we must take good care of all such things, since, if we bring men straight of limb and understanding to so important a study, and so important a training, and educate them, justice herself will not blame us, and we shall save the city and the regime, while in bringing men of another sort to it, we shall do exactly the opposite, and also pour even more ridicule over philosophy. That, he said, would indeed be shameful. Most certainly, I said. But I seem to have been somewhat ridiculously affected just now. How's that, he said. I forgot, I said, that we were playing and spoke rather intensely. For as I was talking, I looked at philosophy, and seeing her undeservingly spattered with mud, I seemed to have been vexed and said what I had to say too seriously, as though my spiritedness were aroused against those who are responsible. No, by Zeus, he said, that's not the way you seemed to me, the listener. But to me, the speaker, I said. And let's not forget that in our former selection we were picking old men. But in this one, that isn't admissible. For we mustn't trust Solon when he says that in growing old a man is able to learn much. He's less able to do that than to run, and all the great and numerous labors belong to the young. Necessarily, he said. Well then, the study of calculation and geometry and all the preparatory education required for dialectic must be put before them as children, and the instruction must not be given the aspect of a compulsion to learn. Why not? Because, I said, the free man ought not to learn any study slavishly. Forced labors performed by the body don't make the body any worse, but no forced study abides in a soul. True, he said. Therefore, you best of men, I said, don't use force in training the children in the studies, but rather play. In that way, you can also better discern what each is naturally directed toward. What you say makes sense, he said. Don't you remember, I said, that we also said that the children must be led to war on horseback as spectators, and if it's safe anywhere, they must be led up near and taste blood, like the puppies. I do remember, he said. Then in all these labors, studies, and fears, I said, the boy who shows himself always readiest must be chosen to join a select number. At what age, he said. After they are released from compulsory gymnastic, I said. For this is a time, whether it is 2 or 3 years, during which it is impossible to do anything else. Weariness and sleep are enemies of studies. And at the same time, one of their tests, and that not the least, is what each will show himself to be in gymnastic. Of course, he said. Then after this time, I said, those among the 20-year-olds who are given preference will receive greater honors than the others, and the various studies acquired without any particular order by the children in their education must be integrated into an overview which reveals the kinship of these studies with one another and with the nature of that which is. At least only such study, he said, remains fast in those who receive it. And it is the greatest test, I said, of the nature that is dialectical and the one that is not. For the man who is capable of an overview is dialectical, while the one who isn't is not. I share your belief, he said. Well then, I said, in terms of these tests, you will have to consider who among them most meets them, and is steadfast in studies and steadfast in war, and the rest of the duties established by law, and to these men in turn, when they are over 30, you will give preference among the preferred, and assign greater honors, and you must consider testing them with the power of dialectic, who is able to release himself from the eyes and the rest of sense, and go to that which is in itself and accompanies truth. And here, my comrade, you have a job requiring a great deal of guarding. Of what in particular? He said. Don't you notice, I said, how great is the harm coming from the practice of dialectic these days? What's that? He said. Surely its students, I said, are filled full with lawlessness. Very much so, he said. Do you suppose it's any wonder, I said, that they are so affected? And don't you sympathize? Why exactly should I? He said. It is like the case of a changeling child, I said, reared in much wealth, in a numerous and great family amidst many flatterers, who on reaching manhood becomes aware that he does not belong to these pretended parents, and isn't able to find those who really gave him birth. Can you divine how he would be disposed toward the flatterers, and toward those who made the change, in the time when he didn't know about the change, and then again when he did know it? Or do you want to listen while I do the divining? That's what I want, he said. Well then, I said, I divine that in the time when he doesn't know the truth, he would be more likely to honor his father and his mother, and the others who seem to be his kin, than those who flatter him. And he would be less likely to overlook any of their needs, less likely to do or say anything unlawful to them, and less likely to disobey them in the important things than the flatterers. That's to be expected, he said. And when he has become aware of that which is, I divine that now he would relax his honor and zeal for these people, and intensify them for the flatterers, be persuaded by them a great deal more than before, and begin to live according to their ways, and have unconcealed relations with them. For that father and the rest of the adoptive kin, unless he is by nature particularly decent, he wouldn't care. Everything you say, he said, is just the sort of thing that would happen. But how does this image apply to those who take up arguments? Like this. Surely we have from childhood convictions about what's just and fair, by which we are brought up, as by parents, obeying them as rulers and honoring them. Yes, we do. And then there are other practices opposed to these, possessing pleasures that flatter our soul and draw it to them. They do not persuade men who are at all sensible. These men rather honor the ancestral things, and obey them as rulers. That's so. Then what, I said, when a question is posed and comes to the man who is so disposed, what is the fair? And after answering what he heard from the lawgiver, the argument refutes him, and refuting him many times and in many ways, reduces him to the opinion that what the law says is no more fair than ugly, and similarly about the just and good, and the things he held most in honor. After that, what do you suppose he'll do about honoring and obeying as rulers the things he heard from the lawgiver? Necessarily, he said, he'll neither honor nor obey them any longer in the same way. Then, I said, when he doesn't believe, as he did before, that these things are honorable or akin to him, and doesn't find the true ones, is it to be expected that he will go to any other sort of life than the one that flatters him? No, it isn't, he said. Then, I suppose, he will seem to have become an outlaw from having been a law-abiding man. Necessarily. Isn't it to be expected, I said, that this is what will happen to those who take up the study of arguments in this way? And as I was just saying, don't they deserve much sympathy? And pity, too, he said. Lest your 30-year-olds be recipients of this pity, mustn't you take every kind of precaution when they turn to arguments? Quite so, he said. Isn't it one great precaution not to let them taste of arguments while they are young? I suppose you aren't unaware that when lads get their first taste of them, they misuse them as though it were play, always using them to contradict, and imitating those men by whom they are refuted, they themselves refute others, like puppies enjoying pulling and tearing with argument at those who happen to be near. They certainly have, he said, a preternatural tendency in that direction. Then when they themselves refute many men and are refuted by many, they fall quickly into a profound disbelief of what they formerly believed. And as a result of this, you see, they themselves and the whole activity of philosophy become the objects of slander among the rest of men. Very true, he said. An older man, however, I said, wouldn't be willing to participate in such madness. He will imitate the man who's willing to discuss and consider the truth, rather than the one who plays and contradicts for the sake of the game. And he himself will be more sensible and will make the practice of discussion more honorable instead of more dishonorable. That's right, he said. And wasn't everything that was said before this also directed to precaution, that those with whom one shares arguments are to have orderly and stable natures, not as is done nowadays in sharing them with whoever chances by, and comes to it without being suited for it? Most certainly, he said. If a man is to devote himself exclusively to steady and strenuous participation in arguments, exercising himself in a gymnastic that is the antistrophe of the bodily gymnastic, will double the number of years devoted to gymnastics suffice? Do you mean 6 years, he said, or 4? Don't worry about that, I said. Set it down at 5. Now, after this, they'll have to go down into that cave again for you, and they must be compelled to rule in the affairs of war and all the offices suitable for young men, so that they won't be behind the others in experience. And here, too, they must still be tested, whether they will stand firm or give way when pulled in all directions. How much time do you assign to this, he said. 15 years, I said. And when they are 50 years old, those who have been preserved throughout and are in every way best at everything, both in deed and in knowledge, must at last be led to the end. And lifting up the brilliant beams of their souls, they must be compelled to look toward that which provides light for everything. Once they see the good itself, they must be compelled, each in his turn, to use it as a pattern for ordering city, private men, and themselves for the rest of their lives. For the most part, each one spends his time in philosophy, but when his turn comes, he drudges in politics and rules for the city's sake, not as though he were doing a thing that is fine, but one that is necessary, and thus always educating other like men and leaving them behind in their place as guardians of the city. They go off to the Isles of the Blessed and dwell. The city makes public memorials and sacrifices to them as to demons, if the Pythia is in accord, if not as to happy and divine men. Just like a sculptor, Socrates, he said, you have produced ruling men who are wholly fair. And ruling women too, Glaucon, I said. Don't suppose that what I have said applies any more to men than to women, all those who are born among them with adequate natures. That's right, he said. If they are to share everything in common equally with the men, as we described it. What then? I said. Do you agree that the things we have said about the city and the regime are not in every way prayers, that they are hard, but in a way possible, and that it is possible in no other way than the one stated? When the true philosophers, either one or more, come to power in a city, they will despise the current honors and believe them to be illiberal and worth nothing, putting what is right and the honors coming from it above all, while taking what is just as the greatest and the most necessary, and serving and fostering it. They will provide for their own city. How? He said. All those in the city who happen to be older than 10, they will send out to the country, and taking over their children, they will rear them, far away from those dispositions they now have from their parents, in their own manners and laws that are such as we described before. And with the city and the regime of which we were speaking thus established most quickly and easily, it will itself be happy and most profit the nation in which it comes to be. That is by far the quickest and easiest way, he said. And how it would come into being, if it ever were to come into being, you have, in my opinion, Socrates, stated well. Isn't that enough already, I said, for our arguments about this city and the man like it? For surely it's plain what sort of man we'll say he has to be. It is plain, he said. And as for what you ask, in my opinion, this argument has reached its end.